Hi everyone. So in today's lecture, we are going to be looking at water. And again, we're going to be looking at water in relation to how it affects plant growth and development. But first, we are going to review. So in last lecture, we looked at temperature as it relates to plant growth and development. And temperature has a number of effects at different developmental stages. And we started by looking at germination. And we said that temperature affects the speed of germination, so how fast your seeds will germinate, as well as the percentage, so the overall number that will germinate in a seed lot. With both generally increases in temperature, increasing both speed and percentage. Right? We also saw that there's a range of a tolerance for germination of your plants, and often the optimal germination is towards the warmer range. That's why increasing temperatures tends to increase germination speed and percentage. We also saw that colder temperatures are important as well for some of our plants and some of our seeds. And that is because cold temperature is used to break seed dormancy. And we've mentioned seed dormancy is this suspended animation essentially, where even if you have the factors you need for germination, water, oxygen, and the right temperature, your seed still won't germinate. And there are different types of dormancy. Exogenous, which is some factor outside of the embryo. Often a seed coat is a good example, a hard seed coat that doesn't let water in. But there's also endogenous dormancy, which is a factor related to the embryo, right? That is keeping the seed or keeping the embryo dormant. And a way to alleviate that endogenous dormancy is this process of stratification, where you expose your seeds to a period of chilling temperatures while keeping them moist, and doing that will alleviate this dormancy. And it's related to adaptations and where these plants evolved, etc. But that is the process that I want you to know. And depending on the species, the length of that stratification will vary. A lot of our crop species, we have bred out this dormancy condition, but if you're growing wild plants, a lot of your wild plants, they'll still be dormancy and you'll have to do the stratification process. So besides germination, temperature also regulates vegetative growth, with increases in temperature leading to faster growth and development. And this is because temperature regulates metabolic processes, including photosynthesis. And again, photosynthesis, anything that affects photosynthesis is going to affect plant growth and development. But there is a limit, right? And that limit seems to be about 86 degrees Fahrenheit, where you will get increases in plant growth development as you get closer to 86. But once you get past that, you don't really see any greater increase in plant growth and development. Another way that temperature affects vegetative growth is this process of diff, which is the difference between day temperature and night temperature. And what's really interesting is that, so you would subtract them, right? So you would keep track of what the temperature is during the daytime and the temperature is during the nighttime. And the closer those temperatures are, or if you have even warmer temperatures at night, it affects the height of your plant, right? So if you get a low number diff or even a negative diff, you will have shorter plants. So this is another way that we can influence the height of our plants. We saw one way is using blue light, right? Another way now is through this diff process by affecting or utilizing changes in temperature between night and day. Lastly, temperature affects our development, right? It is going to speed up growth. It also speeds up development with warmer temperatures. Again, up to that 86 degrees Fahrenheit. And cold temperatures can be important for other developmental processes, particularly plant flowering. There's a process of vernalization, which certain plants need to be exposed to a period of cold, just similar to when we're talking about stratification and dormancy. They need to be exposed to a period of chilling temperatures in order for them to flower. These are often our biennial plants that have 2 growing seasons. And lastly, we looked at what happens if it's too hot or too cold. Both are bad, right? If it gets too hot, it's going to can destroy cells. We said solarization and sun scald were 2 examples of that, but essentially the temperatures get too high and they destroy cells and destroy plant tissues. Too cold has the same things. It'll lead to cell death. You can often see this at the end of the year or maybe early on in the year if you have when you have a frost that develops, like at nighttime, temperatures get real cold and you get a frost that develops. What happens is actually the water in the cells will freeze, it causes cells to rupture, and it leads to plant death. And we see that with blackened leaves or blackened tissues. So a way to help avoid that if it's early in the season or you're trying to extend your growing season later on is to cover your plants with plastic or mulch, particularly at nighttime when they're going to lose more heat. You may be able to spray water if you're talking about maybe have an orchard, and you can spray your trees with water. And what happens when ice forms? It actually releases heat. So this is a way to actually protect your plants. But you have to be careful with that, right? Not too much water or not too little water. You can also burn some smudge pots in your field to create some heat as well. So that is that. Let us get on with our lecture. So we are going to be looking at a couple different things in this lecture, and we're going to start by looking at some of the properties of water. And that's important because those properties are going to influence or help explain how water is able to move into a plant and then up and throughout the plant and eventually evaporate out through the leaves. And that process is called the transpiration stream. So we're going to look at that as well, right? It's really important. It's how our plants are able to take in water. We'll briefly discuss soil water availability, right? So we will learn the process by which plants take in water, but then in order for them to take in water, there needs to be water available in the soil. And then after all that, we'll talk a little bit about how water affects plant growth and development, right, at different stages of our plant. And then lastly, we'll have a slight talk on how much water do our plants actually need. So let's get into some of our properties of water. And the first property that we're going to look at is this idea of polarity. And what this means is that if we look at a water molecule, right, H2O, 2 hydrogen atoms, 1 oxygen atom, we see that if we're looking at that molecule, that one end of that water molecule has a more positive charge down here, whereas the other end, closer to where the larger oxygen is, has a more negative charge, right? And this is polarity. And essentially what it means is that our water molecules can kind of act like magnets, right? Where they have a positive end and a negative end. And as a result, there are some interesting properties that occur. Right? You've probably learned about hydrogen bonding in introductory chemistry class. Right? But it's a bond that forms between the positive end of one water molecule and the negative end of another. And you can see it right here. Right here are 2 hydrogens that have our positive end. Here's our oxygen with our negative end. And that hydrogen bond can form between them. And that bond results in this property of cohesion, which is a force of attraction between like molecules. So in this case, water, right? And what this means is that water molecules are attracted to other water molecules, right? Because of those hydrogen bonds. So you can get a situation like this with like a raindrop or a drop of water that's forming on a leaf, right? Those water molecules are attracted to each other through this cohesion, and they are forming a ball. Otherwise, this would just drop, right? You wouldn't be able to see a water drop remain in that shape. Similarly, there's this process of adhesion, right? So just like water is attracted to other water molecules, water molecules are also attracted to other types of molecules, not just other water molecules. And this is the process of adhesion, right? So cohesion is water molecules attracted to each other. Adhesion is water molecules attracted to other molecules. And again, it's due to that process or that property of polarity, right? These water molecules are attracted to other molecules in other substances that also have either a positive or negative charge, right? So if we looked at cohesion, right, it's caused the formation of water drops, those water molecules attracted to each other. Adhesion causes the drops to cling to the surface, right? So instead of these water drops falling from our leaf blade, they are clinging to the leaf blade. And again, this is due to that polarity that we see in our water molecules. Both adhesion and cohesion, which we refer to as matrix potential, are going to affect water movement, right, in combination with gravity, especially if we're talking about water moving through the soil that you may see here, right? It's not just going to move straight down, but it will move out into the sides. Again, this is due to that adhesion and cohesion properties. And it can affect how water will move through the plant, as we'll see in the transpiration stream, or how it may move across some sort of wicking system that you see here, right? All of this, as we're going to see, is related to these properties. Now, water movement is also affected by both positive and negative pressure, as well as osmotic pressure. So if we're talking about positive pressure, that is pressure that is pushing water, right? You can think of water moving through a hose, or in this case, this irrigation hose, right? And it's the pressure of water that's traveling through here that is pushing that water through and ultimately pushing it out through these little holes to irrigate a field. Now, the opposite of that is negative pressure, and that is pressure that is pulling water. And you can think of a straw, right, where you're sucking air out and it's creating a vacuum, and that's going to pull water up through the straw, right? And that is negative pressure. Also mentioned osmotic pressure. So osmosis, again, you've probably learned about this in chemistry, is the flow of water through a membrane from a solution that has a low solute concentration to a solution that has a high solute concentration, right? So here's our semi-permeable membrane. This may be like remember what's a semi-permeable membrane? Our cell membrane, right? It lets some things in, some things out. So moving through a semi-permeable membrane, you could have a situation where there is water that has a low solute concentration, so not a lot of minerals or elements in it. And you can have on the other side a water with a high solute concentration. And water is going to flow from that low solute concentration to that high solute concentration, right? It's trying to dilute this to make it even, an even amount of solute on each side. Now, this is actually the process by which water is going to enter our roots, as we're going to see. But what this also means is that if we have too much fertilizer ions, right, too many mineral elements in our soil, it can prevent this process, right? Because we could have a buildup here. Think of our soil water over here, and this is the water in our plants, right? Typically, we have a bunch of mineral or elements, mineral ions in our plants, and that's going to lead water to flow into it. But if we get a buildup of fertilizer on this side, it can prevent this osmotic process, and we can actually see the reverse, and water can flow out of our plant, right? And we see this sometimes in our plants, and what we see is fertilizer burn, right? This is also this process, or this process is one of the reasons why salt water can negatively impact our plants as well, right? Salt water is going to contain salt, NaCl, right? It'll have sodium and chloride ions or chlorine ions. And that's a buildup of solute over on this side. So we can prevent this osmotic process and actually pull water from our plant as well. It's one of the factors or one of the effects of salt water on plants. Now, salt water can also result in toxicity related to that sodium and chlorine or chloride ions, and it can impact other nutrients as well. But if we're just talking about the flow of water, it can impact the flow of water because of this osmosis process. So ultimately, when we combine all of these processes together, we get what is referred to as this property of water potential. And that's going to determine the direction that water flows. And it's determined by all those things I just talked about, right? Adhesion, cohesion, osmosis, and positive and negative pressures. We combine them all and we get a value of water pressure. And what you should know is that water will flow from a high water potential to a low water potential, right? So combining, all of those things, we classify that as water potential, and then we'll get a value for it, and then water is going to flow from high water potential to low water potential. So given those properties that we just looked at, how are our plants able to absorb water from the soil and then conduct it throughout the plant or throughout its tissues? And this is a pretty amazing process if you consider some of the size of our plants, right? Think of those giant sequoias or coastal redwoods that are massive in scale, and they're able to take water from that soil and transport it up throughout that entire tree to the tip of its canopy. So we can look at the process of getting water into the plant and moving through the plant as actually two processes, right? And the first is, how does water get into the root? And then the second is, then once it's in the root, how does it travel up the plant? So to get into the root, it's going to use that process of osmosis, right? So our plants also need mineral ions, as we're going to learn when we start talking about fertilizer and their mineral needs. So our plants are going to pump mineral ions into the root cells through active transport. So they're going to use energy to pump mineral ions into them. That process creates a concentration gradient where now we have more solute, right? Remember that slide on osmosis. We're going to have more solute or more ions within the cells, within our root cells, than outside of them. And if we have that process and water is in our soil, it's going to result in water moving into the plant cells because of that osmosis, right? It's going to move from where there is low solute in our soil water to where there is higher solute within our plant cells, right? So that's that process of osmosis, and that's the first step in this of how our plants absorb and conduct water, right? It's how water gets into the root. It's going to travel into the root through osmosis. Now, once it's in the root, that water makes its way to the xylem. And then there's a little bit of positive root pressure. So just the pressure of water in the soil and then flowing into the plant is going to create some positive pressure. Like think of like a hose that's going to push some of that water up into the xylem. And then the remaining way that the water is going to travel up the plant is through a negative water potential that is created from the transpiration of water from the leaves. When we talk about transpiration, all that means is the evaporation of water from the leaves. And we're going to look at that now. So this process is referred to as the transpiration stream. And as I mentioned, right, it's water that is evaporating from our leaves that is resulting in this negative water potential that's essentially going to pull water up throughout the entire plant. And if you guys recall from our leaf anatomy, there are those pores that are on the bottom of our leaves, on most of the time on the bottom of our leaves, referred to as those stomata, right? And they let gases in and out, right? Important for photosynthesis. But when they're open, they also allow for water to transpire or evaporate from our leaves, and this results in this process, right? So water is lost to the atmosphere from those stomata, right? And as that happens, these mesophyll cells that are found, and remember again, looking at our leaf anatomy, essentially most of the cells except for our xylem or vascular tissue are these mesophyll cells. So those mesophyll cells become dry as water evaporates from our leaves, right? And that creates a water potential difference between our dry mesophyll cells and then the cells that are adjacent to them that are moist. And what happens is water then begins to diffuse into the dry cells, right? So we have at our leaves here, we have our stomata are open, and that's causing water to evaporate out into the atmosphere or transpire. That's going to dry up these cells, and as those cells start to dry, water from the adjacent moist cells are going to diffuse into those dry cells. This essentially creates a chain reaction that is going to continue all the way down to the roots, right? And it's because of those processes. Remember, we looked at that adhesion and cohesion, right? So as water molecules begin to diffuse into the dry cells, it pulls other water molecules with them. They pull other water molecules with them, right? They have those hydrogen bonds, and water is attracted to other water molecules. So it starts pulling water with it, and that chain reaction travels all the way down to the roots. Right? And that results in water ultimately moving up from the soil and or from the roots all the way up through the top of the plant. And again, this is referred to as the transpiration stream. It's actually a really neat process that is or a really neat effect that is a relatively simple process, right? And the amount of transpiration is going to be determined on the humidity, right? Because in order for this process to occur, that water needs to be evaporating from the leaves. And if it's very humid, that evaporation may not happen or it may be lower. So it's why, especially when we are propagating certain plants or doing certain types of propagation with cuttings where we don't have a root system developed yet, we keep it very, very humid because that prevents this transpiration from occurring. So that's transpiration stream, right? And there's other couple things that are important. Those stomata need to be open, etc. So that's how water moves through the plant, right? That process. But in order for water for our plants to actually be able to utilize that process, there needs to be water available in the soil. And one of the main factors that is going to influence soil water availability is our soil texture. So when we talk about texture, that is the size of particles that make up your soil. So soil itself is essentially crushed rock, right, or crushed stone, mixed with some organic matter, and we'll might discuss a little bit about that in the course. We go over it more so in plant propagation. But it's the texture of those particles or the size of those particles that's going to influence the amount of water that can be held in that soil. And if we were discussing soil texture, where there are three classes of particles, right? Sand, silt, and clay, with sand being the largest and clay being the smallest. And this size is really important because the size of these particles is going to affect the pore space, right? So if you have a lot of big particles, think of like big rocks, right? If we're trying to get this as a visual that we can see, and we put those big rocks in a jar, we're going to see that there's going to be a lot of space between each individual rock or individual particle. Whereas if we have smaller rocks, right, like something like clay, right, if we're thinking of this as a visual example, there's a lot less pore space, right? They're able to be packed tighter together. Well, when there's a lot of space, that is going to allow for water to move through relatively quickly, right? If you're pouring water through this and there's these big open gaps, water is going to be able to travel through relatively fast. Whereas if you have smaller spaces, like you see down here, water's not going to be able to travel through. So as a result, if you have a soil that has more clay in it, right, or a very clay soil, or soil that has small particles, right, it's going to hold water a lot better than soil that has bigger particles or is made up mostly of sand, right? Again, because of that pore size. Now, holding water isn't always the optimum situation, right? If you get very clay soils, it holds too much water, and that can lead to waterlogged soil and some other problems that we're going to look at in the next lecture, right? Besides these pore spaces holding water, they also need to hold air or oxygen for our plant roots. So if this is filled up with water, oxygen is not going to be available, and that leads to these hypoxic situations and root rot and plant death as well. But in general, if we are looking for ideal soils, you're going to want something kind of in the middle, right? That has a mix of silt and maybe a little sand, maybe a little clay, but somewhere in the middle that is able to hold water but not too much water, right? To prevent oxygen from entering our soil as well. So we looked at some properties of water. We discussed how water moves through their plant, right? It gets into the root through osmosis, and then that transpiration stream occurs, right? Water evaporates from our plant cells or plant leaf mesophyll cells right through that stomata. And that results in this chain reaction of then water moving from wet cells to the dry cells and pulling other water molecules along with them as they go. Then we looked a little bit very, very quickly at soil water availability, and it's the texture of our soils that's to determine how much water is held in our soils, with clay soils holding a lot of water because of the small pore spaces, and sandy soils holding less water because of those big pore spaces. And now we're going to look at how water affects plant growth and development. And we're going to see that it has a couple of effects or a number of effects, some of which that we've kind of looked at before. All right. So as we're going to see, water is required for seed germination, right? It's one of the first steps, or it's that first step of seed germination after that dormancy condition's been alleviated. Water also provides structural support to our plant, right? It actually makes up around 90% of the plant's mass. Water is important for mineral and metabolite transport, right? So once those minerals are pumped into our plant roots, they're going to need water to travel up through the plant. And then water is also required for photosynthesis. And again, photosynthesis is that process by which our plants are taking carbon in the form of carbon dioxide from the air and using water and photons or energy from light to create glucose molecules and oxygen as a byproduct. And that glucose molecule is going to be broken down to provide energy for our plant. It then is also transformed into a whole bunch of other molecules through all these other metabolic processes. And as we've discussed, it's that photosynthesis that ultimately is going to determine the yield of your plants, right? So if we're trying to maximize yield, we want to maximize photosynthesis, and we can do that in a number of ways, right? We can get more light, as we've talked about. Now we're going to see we can influence or change the amount of water that can also impact photosynthesis. Or in the last lecture as well, we can increase temperatures, right? Because the faster the temperature or the hotter the temperature, the faster the rate of photosynthesis. So it's going to be a common theme when we're looking at trying to impact yield, right? Everything that we're doing or whatever is going to impact photosynthesis is going to impact your yield. And there's a number of things that can impact photosynthesis. So before we get to that, let's start with germination, right? And we've mentioned this a number of times, but that germination starts, that first part of germination starts with the imbibition of water. And imbibe means to just take in. So the first step of germination is our seeds are taking in water, right? And that's going to kickstart this entire process of ultimately, we've looked at that pattern of first that radical emergence, our primary root emerging, and then later on our stem, right? We looked at the different patterns, right? Hypogeal versus epigeal, etc. So water is important for germination. Water is also important for structural support, right? Particularly in our herbaceous plants, right? And we've mentioned this earlier when we looked at our plant cells, right? What do our plant cells have? That central vacuole, right? And if that vacuole has a lot of pressure or if that vacuole has water in it, it's able to exert what is referred to as turgor pressure, right? So it's able to exert pressure in the cell, and that's going to push the cell membrane up against the cell wall. And it's going to really result in what you would think of as a fully watered or non-wilted plant that you see here, right? But if there's not enough water in our plant, there's not going to be that turgor pressure, so that vacuole gets smaller, you see there, and it doesn't press the rest of the cell or that cell membrane up against the cell wall, and it results in wilting. And you've all seen wilted plants, right? You see there. But this also results in some other structural changes as well, particularly in our cell wall, right? So if a very fully watered plant, your cell walls tend to elongate, as opposed to if you are in this other process where you have that low turgor pressure and you're starting to wilt, your cell walls are going to go thicker and stronger, right? Because this is an adaptation. If you have enough water pressure, it is providing that structural support, right? The pressure of the vacuole expanding is putting pressure on your cell membrane. It's providing some structural support to your cells. If you don't have that, essentially your cell walls need to make up that structural support or that lack of structural support. So they become thicker and stronger. Now, we could of some of this process by doing this thing called drying down, where we may intentionally withhold water to plants, especially as those plant stems are elongating, as a strategy to keep them short. But you have to make sure that you are not drying out your plant entirely, leading to plant death, right? So here's another method. We've looked at now multiple methods of trying to keep plants short. We've said blue light has that effect. When we looked at temperature, we looked at that process of diff, right? The difference between night temperature and day temperature that could lead, and you have a negative diff, could lead to shorter plants. And now we have this process of drying down that can also result in shorter plants. So if you are interested in growing shorter plants, you now have 3 strategies to do so. So as I said, plant growth and development is also important for mineral and metabolite transport, right? And this is our vascular system of our plants. Remember, our xylem transports our water. and our phloem transports our food, right? And now when I say xylem in water, that water also, the xylem also transports minerals as well, right? So that should have been the caveat that I said in the beginning. But our xylem tissue is traveling, transports water and minerals from the roots up through the rest of the plant, right? And water is we need water in order to do that, just like we need water to transport our food and other metabolites that are produced in the phloem. Additionally, water is required for photosynthesis, right? And I've mentioned that process multiple times now, I think multiple times in this lecture, right? It's an integral part of photosynthesis. And without water, you cannot have photosynthesis. And thus, without photosynthesis, you're not going to have plant growth, right? So as I talked about a couple slides ago, whatever factor is, or whatever thing is going to impact photosynthesis is ultimately going to impact your yield and or quality of your plant product. So we need adequate water, or we need enough water to ensure that photosynthesis is occurring, right? Because that's going to ensure that we are getting the plant yields that we want. But that brings up the question of how much water do plants need? Now, this is going to be plant specific, right? Really depending on the evolutionary history of our plants and where they evolved and what region in which the world they evolved with the climate, uh, with that region's climate, our plants are going to have different water needs, right? As some examples, your beans, your snap and your pole beans are often drought resistant. Tomato, squash, and melons have deep root systems that can draw moisture deep from the soil, so they can withstand drought if they have adequate water early in the growing season. So some of the characteristics of our plants are going to impact this as well, as we see there with our deeper root system plants. A lot of our cold season crops, your peas, lentils, cabbage, Brussels sprouts, cauliflower, broccoli, lettuce, corn, are not drought resistant, and so they need a lot of water. So again, how much water our plants need is a little bit of plant specific, right? With different plants having different watering needs, and that's also going to be impacted by the environment, right? Temperature and humidity. The hotter the temperature, the more transpiration is going to occur, the more water that will evaporate from our plant. The higher the humidity, though, that can prevent some of that, right? So these factors are going to play a role in your plant's water needs throughout its life cycle. So there's a little quantified data in terms of water needs, at least that I could find, right? Where they need this much amount of water if you're growing your plant for this much time or at this life cycle. There was a study that I found that was done at the University of Georgia and University of Florida, and they quantified water needs for petunias. And they used soil moisture sensors, excuse me, that looked at the volumetric water content of the soil. So essentially the amount of water in the soil. And they grew plants at these different water or different soil moisture levels for 3 weeks, right? They grew plants ranging from 5 to 40% soil moisture. And what they found that 5 to 10% was the lower limit of plant survival. So our plants needed at least 5 to 10% water or soil moisture while they were growing. They also found that plant growth increased with increasing soil moisture up until a point, right? Up until about 25% soil moisture, we saw an increase in plant growth. And they found that they were able to produce quality plants at around 20% moisture. And that turned out to be around 16 ounces of water per plant, right? So for the 3 weeks, each plant needed about 16 ounces of water through that 3-week time span. And that turned out to about a little more than a tablespoon of water a day, right? So again, this is plant specific to petunias. It's also specific to the early part of its life cycle, right? So from 0 to 3 weeks, right? This may change as our plants get bigger, obviously. And this is also going to be specific to the temperature and the humidity in which these plants were grown, which I could find that data if I go through and look at the study again, right? But it gives you a little bit of a starting point, and it does highlight a couple of points, right? That in general, plant growth is going to increase with increases in soil moisture, but that is up to a point. Just like our plants have that optimum growing temperature, right? They have that range in which they will grow, and then they have an optimum, or especially for growing and for germination, and as well as growing, right? Up until about 86 degrees Fahrenheit. It seems to be similar with soil moisture, where as you increase soil moisture, you will see increases in plant growth up until a point. And if you go beyond that, right, on either end, right, if you don't have enough soil moisture, you'll have plant death. And if you get too much, you will have plant death, as we're going to see again because of that process of waterlogging and essentially the water taking up all the pore spaces and preventing oxygen from being able, or your roots from being able to access oxygen. And we'll look at that in the next lecture. So that is, you can utilize to do this study on your own or to do something similar on your own. You could get soil moisture meters, and I'm going to look into getting some for our classes as we go forward, but they can be a bit expensive. But you can also do a more low-tech measuring method, and I would encourage you guys to do this if you have house plants, or I'm going to try and do this with us at the last part of the semester. We'll grow some plants and do this technique. But what you want to do is thoroughly water your plants in the morning and let them drain for about 30 minutes. So you're going to fully saturate your soil or your growing media, and then you're going to weigh your pot, and then you're going to let your plant do its thing for 24 hours, and then you're going to come back and you're going to weigh your pot again. And the decrease in weight is the amount of water used by the plant. And if you do this throughout the plant's growing cycle, you can start to quantify the amount of water that is needed by your plant throughout its life cycle. And again, this is going to be affected by environmental factors, right? The conditions in which your plant is growing, temperature, humidity, etc. But what you can do is if you get these data and you get the amount of water that is needed, you can then, if we are growing indoors or if you're growing, yeah, indoors, even outdoors, right? And you have an irrigation system, so if you're watering your plants, you can ensure that the water produced by your irrigation system matches your plant needs. And this is important both to ensure that there's enough water, but also to know that we're not overwatering, right? Where you can lead to those problems in getting waterlogged soil and all the things that are associated with that, but also by conserving water. And water conservation is very, very important, as we're going to see, particularly in the agriculture field and in general, right? Because we are at a water deficit. So we talk more about it in plant propagation, but it's very, very important that we try and be as sustainable as possible with our water uses. And one way to do that is to match water needs with the amount that we are irrigating. And in order to do that, we need to know how much water our plant needs. So we need to have these data in order to do that.